Hey everybody, one of the questions I get asked a lot is, which Bible is the best? Which one should I read? There's so many. Would you believe there are over 400 different translations of the Bible in English? 400! This is nuts. We've got some that are much more popular than others. The King James Version, everybody knows the King James. The NIV, the NASB, the New King James, the English Standard or ESV, the Living Bible, the New Living Bible, the Holman Christian Standard, the Complete Jewish Bible. There's all sorts of different translations. And so it's kind of like, how do we end up with all of this? How do we end up with so many, and why, and which one do I read? And well, part of it, in order to help sort through all of them, is to understand why we have so many. One thing that we oftentimes forget, and I think some people don't realize, is the Bible was originally written in the 1st century, so between about 40 and 80 AD, give or take a few years either way. It was originally written in Hebrew. Almost all what we call the Old Testament, really the Old Covenant, is written in Hebrew. The New is almost all written in Greek, but with a Hebrew understanding to it. And then there's portions that are also in another language called Aramaic, which is similar to Hebrew in some ways. It's almost more like a local dialect of it. Trying to make this very simple. Somebody who's studied is going to look at me and go, that's not exactly... I'm trying to make it easy for you. So basically it was written 2,000 years ago, and then the Old Testament even more, because it was written over the course of about 1,000 years, 400 years before Jesus was born. So you were actually looking at approximately 1,500 years of writing, and the last bit of it that was done was 2,000 years ago. English didn't exist at the time. The concept of English didn't exist. So we've got all of these old writings that aren't in a language that any of us know. And unfortunately, I don't either, because when I was in college, I was a history major, not a biblical studies and language major, so I didn't learn it back then, which makes it harder. Over the course of the years, translations have been made. The translation that Jesus and his disciples used of the scriptures was called the Greek Septuagint. And that was basically the Old Testament, Old Covenant, that had been translated from the original Hebrew into a Greek version by Jewish rabbis. And that is generally what Jesus and his disciples are quoting, is the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures. And then you take the New Testament Greek writings, and they're added to that. So now you've got the Old Hebrew that has been translated into the Greek Septuagint with the New Testament writings added on. Then in the 300s, that was translated into the Latin Vulgate, Vulgate actually standing for vulgar or common language, by Jerome at the behest of the church. So put into a language that at the time was the common language of the world, because the Roman Empire was the ones in charge, so everybody spoke Latin. Well, over the course of time, that kind of got locked in. People stopped speaking Latin, except for in the church. And so the only place you would hear Latin in most of Europe was at church, and most people didn't speak it and didn't understand it, so it made no sense. So that is why in the 14 and 1500s, a movement began translating the Bible into the local languages. And this is where you see Martin Luther and John Wycliffe and Carl Huss. Sorry, old college friend of mine, John Huss. Sorry. We lost Carl this last year. So, any case, sorry, tangent. But that's where you see them all start to come up and translate the Bibles. And among those was William Tyndale. William Tyndale actually was the first printed version of the English Bible. And he didn't quite finish his Old Testament, but he finished the New Testament translation. Was almost done with the Old when they arrested him and burned him at the stake for making something that was illegal at the time, an English translation that people could understand. What's interesting is Tyndale's translation was actually used as the basis for the Geneva Bible. It's almost all his, and then a gentleman named Coverdale finished up the parts that Tyndale hadn't. And that Geneva Bible, which is almost entirely his translation, is really the foundation of the King James. In fact, the King James translation of the Bible is 90% of William Tyndale's translation, that less than 100 years earlier had been illegal and he was killed for. Now all of a sudden the king is saying, hey, let's use it and we'll make my dogs bark. So the King James translation is a translation that is done from the Latin Vulgate, that is done from the Greek Septuagint, that is done from the original Hebrew. So it's a translation of a translation of a translation. And they did have some old manuscripts that they attempted to look at and they attempted to use, but the number of original language manuscripts they had was not very many. Well, one of the things that's happened is archaeology has bloomed, and as people have dug and discovered other things, like the library in Alexandria, the Dead Sea Scrolls for some of our Old Testament scriptures, is we have found all of these older manuscripts than what we had before. We found all sorts of pieces that we didn't know. In fact, our New Testament copies, if you compare to when King James had them, we now actually have copies of manuscripts that are 100 to almost 200 years older than what the King James translators had, which means they're much closer to the original. And with the Old Testament, the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they found that, some of that took them back hundreds of years. So they were able to go back and look at these older versions, closer to the originals, compared to the new and say, okay, has there been errors and corrections and things that showed up? And really, 98%, 99% of the Bible, there's been almost no changes. What you do find is occasional additions. A good example of this is like the last verse of the Lord's Prayer that I was talking about in my prayer message. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Well, that in the oldest scriptures, the oldest copies we have, isn't there. And so you'll see in a couple translations, like the NIV, that rather than have it in the text, they put it in a footnote with a little note there saying older manuscripts don't contain these verses. And there's portions like that. So you'll hear some King James only conspiracy people that will tell you, oh, it's the work of Satan, they're removing verses. Actually, no, they're trying to get it back closer to the original. And now, none of these things that have crept in have changed any meanings, any doctrine, any teaching, nothing at all like that. But if you ever have somebody tell you, well, there's missing verses in that translation, they're not missing, they're in footnotes, and that's why they're there. It's an effort to get the Bible much closer to the original in ways that the King James did not have access to. So that's something to think about why we have new translations, because as they find more scriptures, as they find older copies, they then use those to refine what we do have and to update it. There's also things like language changes. The way we talk is different. Just ask an old person about the slang when they were a teenager versus the new ones. If I start telling you to, gag me with a spoon, that's totally awesome, dude. Well, somebody today is going to look at you like, what kind of freak are you? What are you talking about? Meanwhile, my mom and dad are going to be talking about being groovy. Yeah, they're weird. but language changes, and the words that we use change. And so there are words used in the Old King James that we don't use today. Not only that, but I don't know any of us that walk around going, thee, thou, wherefore art. We don't talk that way. So language changes over time, and so translations are updated with the changing of languages. There's also different reading levels. Sometimes that they will work in the translation trying to make it easier to understand than with others. As an example here, this is my New Living devotional Bible. It's in chronological order, so they've rearranged the books a bit. But it's an easier to read version, and I'll use this for my devotion sometimes because I'm not having to sit there and analyze the language quite so much. So that's one example of easy to read. But then I've also got a Holman Christian Standard, which is a little bit harder to read, a little more stiff. And then I get one of the harder ones in an ESV. Yeah, and then I have my NIV on the shelf too. This is just at home. That's not even counting my office. So I've got all sorts of them here. So different reading languages. Changing culture also plays a huge role in translations. Not just with the way our culture changes today, even from society to society, but even from when Jesus walked the earth. We don't live like Jews 2,000 years ago. We hear the word disciple and we don't understand the context that this is the followers of a rabbi who lived with him, slept in the same place, followed him, did everything with him for years and learning how to be like him. We don't do that today. So we've got these concepts and cultural ideas that are foreign to us. So are some of the expressions, the idioms. We've got a number of things like that. A good example in ancient Near Eastern culture, they would talk about their feelings, their emotions, their affections to come from the gut or from their intestines. Well, we would say it comes from our heart. Another example is my mouth hurts is an old Israel idiom for I'm hungry. And you say that and you're like, what? Really? Here's a good example from Bible Gateway that I pulled off of their site. That imagine that Bob and Jane went into the house and began to argue. You're driving me crazy, Jane said. Stop beating this dead horse. Now, the first sentence is pretty easy. Bob and Jane went into the house, began to argue. Got it. No problem. That's straightforward. Simple description of the activities. But then her next sentence. You're driving me crazy. Okay, now think about that in a society that doesn't have cars or vehicles of any sort. And what would driving mean? If you're driving me crazy, if we translate it word for word, we're being faithful to the original, but then we're going, does that mean that we're driving them to an insane asylum? Are we actually transporting them somewhere? Or are we doing something that's inducing insanity? Really what we're trying to say with this idiom is, you're annoying me. So then do we translate it as, you're annoying me, versus you're driving me crazy? Okay, so it feels a little bit like it's lost some of its original punch if you're trying to put it into a different language, because languages aren't exact. You say you're driving me crazy and you try to put that into another language and they're probably not going to quite get it. So how do you translate that? And then it's always possible that translating it, it stripped out that nuance. But what if a few sentences later, Bob cracks a joke that's directly related to the driving me crazy? Well, yeah, I'm driving you crazy and you sent me on a bus to the moon. What? What happens now if you've taken the driving me crazy and you've translated it as you're annoying me? The other thing makes no sense at all. It's already going to be hard to understand. Then it gets even trickier with the final sentence. That beating a dead horse means pointlessly belaboring a subtle point. But will your non-English reader, are they going to understand what you're trying to say? Why are you dragging around a dead horse? Better yet, why are you beating on a dead horse? What did this dead animal have to do with you? Why haven't you buried it or put it to use? And I don't understand what you're doing with this dead carcass. Trying to translate it into another language, they're going to completely not understand what you're talking about. It's like trying to describe snow to somebody who lives on the Pacific Island and has never seen frozen water. What? Snow? Frozen water that falls from the sky and piles up? You're insane. You're nuts. And so you have to take these concepts and these ideas and you have to put them into a language that it doesn't necessarily fit into. And so how do you do that? And that's one of the other things that's happening with translation is, how can I describe this idea, this concept, this thing, so that it makes sense to the reader? And that's when we realize that every translation has its flaws, its imperfections, because it's people doing it. When we talk about the Bible as perfect, we're not talking about the translation. We're talking about the original, the Hebrew, the Greek, what was written all of those centuries ago. So all of that contributes to why we've got translations. There's also some different ideas in how translations are made. We have what's called a formal equivalence. There's a nice big fancy word. It basically means a word-for-word translation where you look at the original and you try to go as much as possible word for word. Of course, realizing that Hebrew is written in a different order and without vowels, but as much as possible you try to get it pretty close to what that originally was word for word. That's what the ESV is. New American Standard is also a great word-for-word translation, trying to make it as close as possible to the original, which means sometimes translating those idioms that are a little different, things like that. A dynamic equivalent, on the other hand, is what's called a thought for thought. It tries to take a chunk or a portion of it, and what is the point they're making, what's the overall gist of this, and let me try to put that together. And so a thought for thought is going to be more like the New Living. And it's sometimes going to be easier to read, but they're going to try and basically hit the main concepts and put them together. And then you have what's kind of in the middle of those two, and that's where the NIV falls. And it's trying to use both, and okay, we'll balance out here. This works better as word for word, but word for word there's confusing, so now we'll go to the thought for thought. And all your translations fall somewhere on the spectrum, but that kind of gives you an idea. Now, not included in that is the paraphrases. This is the Message. Oh, goodness. The Living Bible is a paraphrase. I'm trying to remember what the one was that had all these extra words thrown in. And a paraphrase is basically where you take a translation and you rewrite it to make it easier. So the Message is not a translation. It's looking at the King James and it's rewriting it for kids. And that's why you run into some phrases in the paraphrases, like Samson beat him up, instead of Samson killed him with the jawbone of a donkey. You get some interesting interpretations sometimes. So paraphrases are not great translations. They're nice for devotionals. They're nice to get a different perspective, but they're not a good translation. They're not translations at all. So that kind of gives you an idea of some of the differences there. You also find that as you go more thought for thought, oftentimes they're easier to read, where the more word for word you are, the more difficult it is to read. And so generally, what I suggest to people, try to get one from each end and then go back and forth a little bit. But what's the best translation out of all of those? I've mentioned a whole bunch of them, and it's easy to get caught up. Well, there's actually a really simple answer to that. The best translation is the one that you're going to pick up and read. Because a translation that's sitting on your shelf gathering dust doesn't do you or anybody else any good at all. But the one that you'll pick up and you'll read and you'll let it become part of your life, that's the best translation for you right there. So if you want to know which Bible to read, go get a few, flip through, see which one you like, and then read that one. Thanks so much for watching. God bless.